Alright guys, hi, it's Miss Levy again, and we're at part 2 of our models review, starting here with Malthus's theory of population and food production and how it would affect one another in the future. The author of this is obviously Thomas Malthus, and the purpose is to explain the effects rapid population growth would have on food availability in England during the late 1700s, keeping in mind that England was going through the Industrial Revolution during this time. So you can see that this is his theory. And refer back to where we began in part 1 about the J curve. This is where the J curve is applicable. So here we have our theory, and this is the green represents the food production and the red represents our population growth. And the point at which population would outpace food, he called the point of crisis. So here's our point of crisis. And this point of crisis was the point at which population would outpace food production, and he believed that there would be a war. And so what he said was, population grows geometrically while food production grows arithmetically. According to Malthus, these growth rates would produce the following relationships between food and people in the future. So as we look at this relationship, we see that, let's say today and then projected 100 years from now, obviously this is hypothetically just to highlight and emphasize the actual theory. So here he has population growing geometrically or exponentially. And here he has food growing arithmetically or linearly. And you can see that his theory, population quickly outpacing food production. So again, these predictions were made just after England became the first country to enter stage 2 of the demographic transition model. So at the time they were experiencing explosive population growth. And so the people who support Malthus and say that this could still happen today, they believe that population growth is increasing today, still the greatest in poorer countries of the world, because of medical growth, not because of growth of wealth. So because of living longer and improvements in medical, and not necessarily because they are improving standard of living, improving wealth, or improving incomes. They're not increasing their food production as quickly as they are increasing their population. And so again, they say that this would lead to this phenomenon of population outpacing food. That population growth is stripping the world of many valuable resources like energy sources, not just food. That now there is increased competition for all of these resources, and they must be shared with the parts of the world that don't contribute as much financially and economically. Let's talk about the critics of this model and who say that this model is not true. We have Buserup and Kuznets. They say that population growth could stimulate economic growth and bring about more food production. Simon said that population could actually stimulate economic growth because more people equals more brains to invent things to improve life. So that population growth is actually a good thing. The Marxists, who are the earliest socialists, they say there's no cause-effect relationship at all between the growth of population and economic development. And there was no way that Malthus could know of the improved technology and the agriculture production that would be coming in later years, and that there would be an introduction of family planning methods and changes in wealth and development that would lead to lower population growth rates. He didn't know because they were the first country to even move through the demographic transition model. Okay, next let's talk about this green revolution, some of these improvements in technology that Malthus could have never have predicted. So the green revolution, this is when we had improvements, including research, development, and technological initiatives to improve agriculture practices. So when we think of the term green today, we think of environmentally eco-friendly. That's not what this is referring to. This is just referring to improvements in agricultural practices, really leading to increased food supply. This occurred in the 1940s to the 1960s, and this was really from MDCs and companies in MDCs, huge agricultural and seed companies like Monsanto, and they were providing this technology to countries. First was Mexico, then to India, Africa, and Asia. And what they provided and what came about were high-yield seeds, so seeds so that the same number of plants could produce more food. Herbicides to kill weeds, pesticides to kill pests, irrigation systems to provide water, and fertilizers to ensure better growth. All of this to increase food supply and to avoid some sort of mass starvation. So what were the impacts? They increased agricultural production around the world. Technologies were diffused around the world, able to avoid a mass famine. And this led to the creation of an entirely new industry within agriculture, the GMOs, the genetically modified organisms. These high-yield seeds were really GMOs, genetically modified organisms. So this brings us to our next agricultural topic, which is the von Thunen's land use model. So obviously this was written by von Thunen, so Johann von Thunen, who was a German, and he wrote this in his book, The Isolated State, in 1826. The purpose was to explain how a farmer decides how to use his farmland regarding what to cultivate and what to raise, what animals to raise. So how does he actually uses farmland in order to, remember, like any business, a farmer wants to maximize profit by minimizing costs. That's the goal of every single business, including a farmer, to maximize profit by minimizing cost. So according to his model, a commercial farmer would initially consider which crops to cultivate and which animals to raise based on market location. So here's our market location at the center in the central city. That the farmer must take into account two main costs, the cost of the land and the cost of the transportation. So cost of land, cost of transportation are the two most important costs in our von Thunen model. And so when he really analyzed where there was different types of agriculture and animals being raised, what he came to was that the goods that are the most expensive to ship or that are perishable will be closer to the central city, where the land is the most expensive, so they're going to use it the most intensively and where they need the least amount of it. While that goods that need lots of land are going to be located the furthest or outside of the central city because that land is the cheapest, and that are inexpensive to ship will be farther from the central city. So if they're inexpensive to ship, they can put them further away because they're going to have to transport them even further. So they'll put them further from the city. And those that require the most land, they need to be out here where the land is the cheapest. Those that are the most expensive to transport and that are perishable and don't need as much land can be here closer to the central city where the land is the most expensive and they can use it the most intensively. So here are our rings. You'll notice that the von Thunen model is similar to the concentric zone model in structure. They were both structured using a series of rings. So in the von Thunen model, at the center of the model, we have our central city. In our ring immediately outside of our central city or our market, that's where the market's located, we have our intensive farming, our market gardening and fruit farming, and our dairying. They need to be located here closest to the central city because they are perishable. They need to be delivered much more frequently. They don't need as much land, so they can be here closest to the central city where the land's most expensive. Then in our second ring out from our market is our forest. Forest was very important during the time because they needed that for building and for fuel. Then in our third ring out, this is our extensive grain farming, our field crops. Again, these are less expensive to transport because you can carry more in bulk and because they need to be transported less often, but they need a lot of land, so they need to be out here where the land is the most is the least expensive. And then all the way out here in the outer ring, this is our ranching, our animal products. So this is our animal grazing, our ranching out here on the furthest. This is because this is the cheapest to transport because they could literally walk them into the market, drive them into the market like on a drive. And then also because it needs the most amount of land, so it needs to be out here where it is the cheapest. Let's talk about the weaknesses, the criticisms of this model, why it no longer applies in the world today. You don't see those same rings and that same format when you look at commercial agriculture in the world today. And that's because during his time, they assumed a uniform landscape, that you'd have those same rings outside of every market or central city because there's really no barrier like mountains or rivers or lakes. We know that that's not true. Also, he assumed that there'd be consistent and productive soil quality and fertility throughout, which is completely untrue. He didn't take into consideration the change in the demand or price of a commodity would change what farmers would produce. He didn't take into consideration innovations like refrigerated trucks or containers where they could expand that milk shed, expand that perishability, that there would be lower transportation costs so it wouldn't matter as much, that social customs, taboos, and government policies could potentially impact what a farmer produces. He didn't take into consideration that agricultural products could be used for more than food, which could drive demand. And so the model is most relevant today, really, on a much more national scale in the United States and on a more regional scale in Europe. So in that national scale in the United States and a more regional scale in Europe, rather than it being just focused on a central city. Okay, next, let's talk about central place theory. And this is created by Walt Christaller. You'll oftentimes see this is referred to as Christaller's central place theory. The purpose of this is, given the size of the settlement, how does a business decide where to locate their service? So again, von Thunen is about agriculture. Central place theory, we're talking about services. And the definition of this seeks to explain the relative size and spacing of towns and cities as a function of people's shopping behavior. And that services would establish a market area based on the range and the threshold. It explains how and where central places, the services, remember the central place is the service, in the urban hierarchy should be functionally and spatially distributed. So when we look at size of settlement, we're talking about from smallest to largest, smallest being hamlet, then village, then town, then city, then megacity. And when we look at the smallest settlements, we should see that goods and services that meet everyday needs, like bakery and dairy products and groceries, very convenience-oriented, those should be in the smallest settlements. Smallest settlements will be situated relatively close to one another because consumers assumed to be spread throughout the countryside will not be prepared to travel far for such convenience items. So you'll tend to see more low-range services in the smaller settlements. Let's talk about the largest settlements. You should tend to see many low-range services, a lot more low-range services like a McDonald's or a convenience store or a 7-Eleven. But you'll also see more specialty, more expensive stores and larger spectator events held in larger settlements. People will be willing to travel farther for more expensive, less frequently purchased items. So the higher range services should be in the largest settlements. So as the settlement size increases, you should see more numerous low-range services. You should also see more high-range services as well. And so the range and threshold are taken into account when deciding where to place a service, where to place this location of this service. Range being that's the maximum distance people are willing to travel in order to patron that service, and the threshold is the minimum number of people within that range the service needs to come in patron their business in order to break even and make a profit. Keeping in mind a service, just like a farmer, just like a manufacturer, and any other business, the goal is to maximize profit by minimizing costs. Okay, this brings us to Wallerstein's world systems theory. This is the same thing as the core periphery model. The author of this is Emanuel Wallerstein. The purpose is to explain the hierarchy of political, economic, and social power among countries throughout the world. According to Wallerstein, every country can be categorized as either core, semi-periphery, and periphery, very similar to MDC, DC, and LDC. That really what that created this dynamic was that the economic and political connections were first established during colonization in the late 15th century and then maintained through increased economic access up into the present. That dynamic between those who are consumers and those who are producers from those that are suppliers, that still exists in the world today. And so we have our core countries. These are our countries with strong economies, with large economic productivity, high per capita GDP, high wealth, the center of political and economic power. These are seen as the MDCs of the world. Then we have our semi-periphery. These are our newly industrialized countries, our DCs, with median increasing standards of living, increasing GDP per capita, increasing levels of wealth, increasing levels of political and economic influence, such as Chile, Brazil, India, China, and Indonesia. They offer their citizens relatively diverse economic opportunities, but also have extreme gaps between rich and poor. Then we have our periphery, the countries that have low levels of economic productivity, low per capita incomes, and generally low standards of living.